The blizzard hit Kyle Patterson like a wall of ice and fury, and somewhere between praying for his horse to keep moving and cursing himself for not staying in Jefferson, Montana territory, he saw what looked like a dark bundle in the snow that might have been human. The year was 1883, and winter in Montana didn't forgive mistakes, didn't care if you were white or Apache or anything in between. And Kyle had seen enough death in his 26 years to recognize it approaching when the bundle didn't move as he dismounted. His boots crunched through snow that was already knee-deep, his buckskin gelding snorting protest behind him, breath coming out in clouds that the wind immediately tore away. He stumbled forward, nearly losing his footing twice, and when he finally reached the bundle, he realized it was a woman wrapped in a blanket that had probably been beautiful once, but was now frozen stiff in places. Her face was partially covered, but he could see enough to know she was Apache and young, and if he didn't get her somewhere warm in the next hour, she'd be dead. Kyle didn't hesitate. He'd left behind a lot of the prejudices other cowboys carried after spending 2 years working alongside men of every color and creed on a cattle drive to Kansas. Dead was dead, and he wasn't about to let another person die if he could prevent it. Getting her onto his horse was harder than he'd anticipated. She wasn't unconscious, but she wasn't exactly conscious either, existing in that dangerous space between where the cold made you stop caring whether you lived or died. Kyle had been there once himself, years back, and he still remembered how peaceful it had felt, how much he'd wanted to just lie down and sleep. He hoisted her up with strength born of desperation, then pulled himself up behind her, wrapping one arm around her waist to keep her upright while the other held the reins. The line shack was another mile north, if he remembered correctly, and he'd stayed there twice before when winter caught him between ranches. It wasn't much, just 4 walls and a roof that probably leaked, but it had a stove and that was all that mattered. The wind screamed around them, and Kyle bent low over the woman, trying to shield her with his own body as much as possible. His face was already numb, his fingers barely able to grip the reins, but he kept the horse moving forward through sheer force of will. When he finally saw the dark shape of the shack emerging from the white chaos, relief flooded through him so intensely his eyes stung. Or maybe that was just the cold. He dismounted first, nearly falling because his legs had gone stiff, then pulled the woman down as gently as he could. She made a small sound, the first noise he'd heard from her, and he took that as a good sign. He got the door open, which was a battle in itself against the wind, and half carried, half dragged her inside. The interior was dark and barely warmer than outside, but at least the wind wasn't tearing at them. Kyle laid her down on the single wooden cot in the corner, then forced himself to go back out for his horse. He couldn't leave the animal to die, not after it had carried both of them through that hell. There was a lean-to attached to the side of the shack, rickety but functional, and he got the horse settled there with a blanket, and what little feed was stored in a barrel that mice had thankfully not discovered. Back inside, Kyle's hands shook so badly he could barely strike a match, but he managed to get the stove lit with kindling that someone had mercifully left behind. The fire caught slowly, reluctantly, as if it too was fighting the cold. Once it was going, he added larger pieces of wood from the small stack beside the stove, then turned his attention to the woman. She was still wrapped in that frozen blanket, and he knew he needed to get her out of it, get her out of any wet clothes. This was the kind of situation that could be misunderstood if anyone ever heard about it, but Kyle pushed that thought aside. Propriety mattered a hell of a lot less than keeping someone alive. He worked carefully, unwrapping the blanket, and found her wearing a dress that was a strange combination of Apache and white styles, with traditional beadwork over a cotton fabric that was definitely soaked through in places. "Can you hear me?" he asked, his voice rough from the cold and from not having spoken in hours. "I need to get you warm. I am going to be respectful, I promise you that, but these wet clothes will kill you if they stay on." Her eyes opened then, dark and unfocused, but aware enough that she was looking at him. "I will be gone by morning," she said, her English clear but accented, each word carefully formed. "You should not waste your time." "Morning's a long way off," Kyle replied, already working at the buttons of her dress with fingers that barely cooperated. "And I didn't drag you through a blizzard to watch you die now." She didn't fight him, which worried him more than if she had. He got her dress off, averting his eyes as much as possible while still making sure he removed everything that was wet. There was a wool blanket on the cot, musty-smelling but dry, and he wrapped her in it before stripping off his own coat and shirt. They were wet too, and he'd be no good to either of them if he succumbed to the cold. He hung everything near the stove, close enough to dry but not so close they'd burn, then added more wood to the fire. The shack was starting to warm up, barely, but it was something. Kyle found another blanket in a trunk, along with a tin of coffee and some beans that looked old but edible. He wrapped the second blanket around his own shoulders, then settled on the floor near the stove, feeding it steadily. The woman on the cot had closed her eyes again, but her breathing seemed steadier, less shallow. "My name is Kyle," he said, more to keep himself awake than anything. "Kyle Patterson. I work ranches wherever they'll have me. Was heading north to a spread near Helena when this storm hit." He paused, adding another piece of wood. "I don't know if you can hear me, but talking seems better than silence right now." "I can hear you." Her voice was soft but clear. "My name is Pale Crow. Your people would say Paloma." Kyle turned to look at her. Her eyes were open again, watching him with an intensity that made him feel seen in a way that was both uncomfortable and oddly comforting. "Paloma," he repeated. "That's a pretty name. Spanish, isn't it?" "My mother's mother was Mexican, captured young and raised Apache. She taught me Spanish and English both, said knowing the languages of your enemies kept you alive." Paloma pulled the blanket tighter around herself. She was right about many things, but she could not have predicted this. "What were you doing out there?" Kyle asked. "Nobody should have been traveling in this weather." "I was traveling to Fort Benton. I have work there, sewing for a dressmaker who does not care that I am Apache, only that my stitches are straight." She closed her eyes briefly. "I knew the storm was coming. I thought I could reach the fort before it hit fully. I was wrong." Kyle could hear the self-recrimination in her voice. "We all make mistakes," he said. "The important thing is you're alive." "For now," she said. "But you heard what I said. I will be gone by morning." "Why do you keep saying that?" He stood up, checking their clothes. The shirt was starting to dry at least. "You're warming up. You'll be fine." "You do not understand." Paloma's voice was patient, as if explaining something to a child. "I have the coughing sickness. I have had it for 3 months now. I was going to the fort to make what money I could before I die, to send it to my sister's children. They are in a mission school in New Mexico. They need shoes and books and things I cannot provide if I am dead with nothing to my name." Kyle felt his stomach drop. The coughing sickness, consumption, tuberculosis. Whatever name you gave it, it was a death sentence. He'd known 3 people who'd had it, and all 3 had died slowly, painfully, coughing up blood until they drowned in it. "Are you sure?" he asked, then felt foolish. Of course she was sure. "I am sure," she confirmed. "I saw a doctor in Fort Shaw. He told me I had perhaps 6 months, maybe less. That was 2 months ago. So you see, you have saved me only to delay the inevitable. I will die anyway, if not tonight, then soon." "But not tonight," Kyle said firmly. Tonight you're alive, and that's what matters." Paloma laughed, a sound that turned into a cough. It wasn't a bad cough, not like the ones he remembered from the people he'd known with consumption, but it was there. When it subsided, she looked at him with something that might have been amusement. "You are stubborn." "I've been told that before," Kyle admitted. "Usually right before someone tells me I'm also foolish." "Perhaps you are both stubborn and foolish," Paloma said, but there was no malice in it. "But I suppose I should thank you." Freezing to death is said to be peaceful, but I do not think I was ready for peace quite yet. Kyle found himself smiling despite everything. "Good, because I went through a lot of trouble to keep you from freezing." The night passed slowly. The storm continued to rage outside, the wind howling around the shack like a living thing trying to find a way in. Kyle kept the fire going, dozing occasionally but never deeply, always aware of the need to maintain the warmth that was keeping them both alive. Paloma slept fitfully, coughing periodically but never severely. Each time she coughed, Kyle found himself listening intently, as if he could diagnose the severity of her illness by sound alone. When gray light finally started filtering through the cracks in the walls, Kyle realized they'd made it through the night. The storm had lessened but not stopped entirely. Snow was still falling, though without the vicious wind that had made the previous evening so dangerous. He stood up, stretching muscles that had gone stiff from sleeping on the floor, and checked their clothes. Everything was dry now, or dry enough. Morning came after all, Paloma said from the cot. She was sitting up, the blanket wrapped around her shoulders, watching him. "I am surprised." "Are you disappointed?" Kyle asked, then immediately regretted the question. It was too direct, too harsh. But Paloma just considered it seriously. "No," she said after a moment. "I am not disappointed. I am confused, perhaps. The doctor said I would grow weaker, that I would cough more, that eventually I would cough blood and then die. But I do not feel weaker. I feel the same as I did a month ago, 2 months ago. Sometimes I think perhaps he was wrong." "Maybe he was," Kyle said, though he knew doctors were rarely wrong about such things. "Or maybe you're stronger than he thought. Perhaps." She looked toward the window, or what passed for one in the shack. "The storm has not stopped." "No, but it's better than it was." "Still too dangerous to travel, though." Kyle moved to the trunk, pulling out the can of coffee and beans. "We should eat something, build up our strength." He heated water on the stove for coffee, and the smell of it filled the small space, rich and comforting. The beans were edible, barely, but they were food, and that was what mattered. He handed Paloma her portion, and she accepted it with a quiet thank you. They ate in companionable silence, the storm continuing its assault outside. "Why were you traveling alone?" Paloma asked after they'd finished eating. "Most white men travel in groups when winter comes." "I got a late start from Jefferson," Kyle admitted. "I'd been doing odd jobs there, saving up money. Got word of steady work in Helena, good pay, and I thought I could make it before the worst of the winter hit. Should have known better." "We are both guilty of poor judgment then," Paloma said. She coughed again, covering her mouth, and Kyle saw a flash of fear cross her face before she controlled it. "No blood, though. That was good. How long do you think the storm will last?" "Hard to say. Could be a day, could be 3. Kyle poured them both more coffee from the pot he'd kept on the stove. "We have enough wood to last maybe 2 days if we're careful. After that, it gets difficult. Then let us hope the storm does not last 3 days. Paloma accepted the coffee, wrapping her hands around the tin cup. "Tell me about yourself, Kyle Patterson. If we are to be trapped here together, we should at least know each other." So Kyle talked. He told her about growing up on a small farm in Missouri, about how his father had died when he was 15, and his mother had followed 2 years later from grief and exhaustion. He told her about heading west with nothing but a horse and his father's old revolver, about working cattle drives and ranches, about learning that the color of a man's skin mattered a lot less than his willingness to work hard and watch your back. He told her about the time he'd broken his arm when a horse threw him, about the cowboy who'd set the bone even though Kyle was white and the other man was black, about how that had taught him that prejudice was just another word for stupidity. Paloma listened, asking questions occasionally, and when he finally wound down, she began to talk about her own life. She'd been born in a canyon in Arizona Territory, part of a small band that had thus far avoided being forced onto a reservation. Her father had been killed when she was 12, in a skirmish with soldiers who'd been trying to relocate them. Her mother had died the following winter from a fever. Paloma had ended up at a mission school, where she'd learned English and sewing and Christianity, though she said the last one had never quite taken. "I tried to believe in the white God," she said, staring into her coffee. "The priests were kind mostly, and they fed us and taught us. But their God seemed to love only white people. When I asked why God let soldiers kill my father, they said it was part of his plan. What kind of plan requires the death of good men? So I kept the sewing and the English and left the God behind." Kyle didn't know what to say to that. His own relationship with God was complicated at best. "My mother believed in God," he said finally. "She prayed every night, even when my father was dying, even when she was starving herself to make sure I had enough to eat. I don't know if it brought her comfort, but I hope it did." "Perhaps faith is different for everyone," Paloma said. "Or perhaps there are many gods and we each find the one that suits us. My grandmother, the Mexican one, she believed that. She said the Spanish tried to kill the Apache gods, but gods do not die so easily." The day passed slowly. The storm continued, though it seemed to be lessening gradually. They talked more, sharing stories, and Kyle found himself fascinated by this woman who spoke 3 languages and could quote the Bible while also explaining Apache beliefs about the spirits in all living things. She was educated in a way he'd never been, but not condescending about it. She listened to his stories about wrangling cattle with the same attention she'd probably give a scholarly lecture. As evening approached, Kyle went out to check on his horse and bring in more wood from the pile in the lean-to. The cold hit him like a fist, even though the wind had died down considerably. He checked the horse, who seemed content enough with the shelter and feed, then grabbed as much wood as he could carry. When he came back inside, Paloma was coughing again, harder this time. He dropped the wood and went to her, but she waved him away. "It passes," she said when she could speak again. "It always passes. Was there blood?" Kyle asked bluntly. "No," she said, and he could see she was telling the truth. "Not yet, but it will come eventually." "Maybe it won't," Kyle said. "Maybe the doctor was wrong." "And maybe the sun will rise in the west tomorrow," Paloma replied, but she was smiling slightly. "You are an optimist, Kyle Patterson." "Someone has to be," he said. They ate more beans for dinner, and Kyle found a deck of cards in the trunk, probably left by some previous occupant. They played poker by firelight, using splinters of wood as betting chips, and Kyle discovered that Paloma was either incredibly lucky or incredibly good at reading people. She won 6 hands out of 10, and he suspected she was letting him win the other 4 out of politeness. "Who taught you to play cards?" he asked after she won another hand with a straight that shouldn't have been possible given the cards he'd seen her discard earlier. "A gambler who stayed at the mission for a month, recovering from a bullet wound," Paloma said, gathering up the cards to shuffle. "He said a woman who could count cards would never starve. I told him a woman who could sew would also never starve and was less likely to be shot. He agreed but taught me anyway." Kyle laughed. I'm starting to think you're better prepared for survival than half the men I've known." "Survival is not the same as living," Paloma said quietly, dealing the next hand. "I have survived for 22 years. I am not sure I have lived for more than a handful of them." The observation hit Kyle harder than he'd expected. When had he last felt truly alive rather than just surviving? He couldn't remember. Working ranches was good, honest work, but it was repetitive, endless. Wake up, work, eat, sleep, repeat. The cattle didn't care about your dreams. The horses didn't ask what you wanted from life beyond your next meal and a place to sleep. "What would you do?" he asked. "If you could do anything, if you weren't sick, if money wasn't a concern, what would you do?" Paloma looked at him, considering. "I would find a place," she said slowly. "Not a ranch, not a town, but somewhere in between. A place with a garden where I could grow vegetables and herbs. A house with a real roof and real windows. I would sow things I wanted to sow, beautiful things, not just practical things. And I would have a horse, a good horse, so I could ride into the mountains whenever I wanted and remember what it felt like to be Apache." "That sounds like a good life," Kyle said. "It is a dream," Paloma replied. "Dreams are for children and fools. I am neither." "Maybe you should be both then," Kyle said. "Maybe we all should be." That night, as the fire burned low and Paloma slept on the cot, Kyle sat and thought about dreams and survival and the woman who'd expected to be gone by morning but was still here. He thought about her courage, facing death with clarity and determination, trying to provide for her niece and nephew even in her final months. He thought about how she laughed when she won at cards, how she'd argued passionately about whether horses or cattle were smarter animals, how she described the canyon where she was born with such love in her voice that he could almost see it. He thought about how he hadn't felt this interested in talking to someone in years, maybe ever. The realization that he was attracted to her hit him suddenly, uncomfortably. This was ridiculous. He'd known her for barely more than a day. She was dying, or thought she was dying, and here he was developing feelings like some fool in a dime novel. But the attraction was there nonetheless, undeniable. Not just physical, though she was beautiful in a way that made his breath catch when she smiled. It was everything about her, the intelligence and humor and strength wrapped up in a person who expected to be dead soon but still fought to live anyway. Kyle added another log to the fire and told himself firmly to stop being an idiot. Tomorrow, or the day after if the weather didn't cooperate, they'd go their separate ways. She'd continue to Fort Benton to sew for her dressmaker and send money to her family. He'd head to Helena for that ranch job. This was just a moment out of time, a shared space created by necessity and a blizzard, and it would end like all such moments did. But when morning came again, the third morning since he'd found her in the snow, the storm had finally stopped. The world outside was buried in white, pristine and deadly, but the sun was shining for the first time in days. Kyle knew they should leave, head their separate ways while the weather held. Instead, he found himself making coffee and breakfast as slowly as possible, stretching out the morning. "The storm has passed," Paloma observed, stating the obvious. She was dressed again in her own clothes, which had dried completely. "We should leave before another one comes." "Probably," Kyle agreed, not moving from where he sat by the stove. "So why are we still sitting here?" She asked it gently, but with genuine curiosity. Kyle looked at her, at this woman who'd told him she'd be gone by morning but who'd defied her own expectations twice now. "Because I don't want you to go," he admitted. "I know that's selfish. I know you have to get to Fort Benton and I have to get to Helena, but I don't want this to end." Paloma was quiet for a long moment. "I do not want it to end either," she said finally. "But wanting and having are different things. I am dying, Kyle. Even if we wanted something more than these few days, I cannot give you more than a few months at best." "What if the doctor was wrong?" Kyle stood up, moving closer to her. "You haven't coughed blood. You don't seem to be getting weaker. What if you're not dying? And what if I am?" Paloma countered. "What then? You would watch me waste away, watch me cough and struggle and eventually drown in my own blood. Would you want that? Would you wish that on anyone you cared about?" "I would want whatever time I could have," Kyle said. "A few months of living is better than a lifetime of just surviving." She stood up then, facing him. They were close enough that he could see the flecks of amber in her dark eyes, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her. "You said that dreaming was for children and fools," he continued. "Maybe you were right, but I am willing to be a fool if you are willing to be a child. Come with me. Not to Helena, not to Fort Benton. Come with me to find that place you described, the one with the garden and the real windows and the horse to take you into the mountains." "That is insane," Paloma whispered, but she didn't move away. "Completely," Kyle agreed, "but I have never felt more sure of anything in my life." "You do not even know me. Not truly. We have had 3 days together, 3 days out of time. That is not enough to make this kind of decision." "Then give me more days," Kyle said. "Give me weeks, months, whatever you can give me. Let me know you truly. And if at the end of it you still think this is insane, then we will go our separate ways. But at least give it a chance." Paloma reached up, touching his face with one hand. Her fingers were warm against his cheek. "I am afraid," she admitted. "I am afraid to hope. Hope is dangerous when you are dying. It makes the ending hurt more." "Then let me hope for both of us," Kyle said, covering her hand with his own. She kissed him then, or maybe he kissed her, or maybe they moved together at the same moment. It was soft and tentative and felt like the most natural thing in the world. When they pulled apart, Paloma was smiling, really smiling, and Kyle thought his heart might burst from the joy of seeing it. "You are a fool, Kyle Patterson," she said. "And you are a child, Paloma Crow," he replied. "Then we are well matched," she said, and kissed him again. They stayed one more night in the shack, though not from necessity. Kyle went out and cleared snow, checking that the path was passable, while Paloma prepared a proper meal from the supplies he'd had in his saddlebags, which he'd forgotten about in the chaos of the first night. She made coffee and fried salt pork, and even managed to make cornbread in a pan on the stove, and they ate like royalty in their tiny kingdom of 4 walls and a roof that only leaked a little. That night, they talked about practical matters. Kyle had money saved, not a fortune but enough to buy a piece of land if they were careful about where they looked. Paloma had some money too, saved from her sewing work. Together, it might be enough for a small place, nothing fancy, but enough to start. "There is a valley," Paloma said, lying on the cot while Kyle sat beside her, their fingers intertwined. "I passed through it on my way north. It is between here and Helena, maybe 2 days' ride south. There were no houses that I saw, no people, but the land was good. Green even in fall when I saw it, with a stream running through it. If no one has claimed it, if we could file a homestead claim, it might be the place we are looking for." "Then that's where we'll go," Kyle said, raising her hand to kiss her knuckles. "We will find this valley and build a house with real windows." "And a garden," Paloma added. "And a garden," Kyle agreed, "and a horse for me to ride into the mountains. And a horse, the best horse we can find." Paloma coughed then, just a small cough, but it reminded them both of the shadow hanging over their happiness. "Kyle," she said when it passed, "I need you to understand something. If I am dying, if the doctor was right, then this will end badly. You will be hurt. You might regret this." "I won't regret it," Kyle said firmly. "I might grieve, but I won't regret it. Every moment with you is worth whatever comes after." "How can you be so sure?" she asked. "Because for the first time in years I feel alive," he said. Not just surviving, but actually living. You gave me that, Paloma. In 3 days, you gave me more life than I'd had in all the years before. So no matter what happens, I won't regret it. She pulled him down to kiss her, and they lay together on the narrow cot, fully clothed but wrapped in each other's arms until sleep claimed them both. Morning brought clear skies and bitter cold. They packed up what little they had, leaving the shack much as they'd found it, but with a stack of fresh wood for the next person who needed shelter. Kyle saddled his horse while Paloma watched, and then he lifted her up before swinging up behind her, just as he'd done 3 days ago in the blizzard. But this time, she was warm and alive and leaning back against him, and he was riding towards something rather than just away from death. They reached Jefferson by late afternoon, the horse tired but steady. The town was small, maybe 200 people, but it had a land office, and that was what they needed. Kyle helped Paloma down, and they walked together to the small building that served as both land office and telegraph station. The clerk was an older man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers. He looked surprised to see an Apache woman walk in with a white cowboy, but he didn't say anything, just asked how he could help them. "We want to file a homestead claim," Kyle said. "Land south of here, in a valley about 2 days' ride away. There's a stream running through it." The clerk pulled out a large map, spreading it on his desk. "You will need to be more specific than that, sir. There are several streams in that area." Paloma leaned over the map, studying it intently. Her finger traced along the paper, following waterways and marking landmarks. "Here," she said finally, pointing to a spot. "This valley along this creek. I passed through in October. I saw no houses, no cattle, no signs of occupation." The clerk examined the map where she'd pointed. "That's unclaimed land as far as I know," he said. "Quarter section would be 160 acres. You would need to build a dwelling, cultivate the land, and live there for 5 years to prove up the claim." "We can do that," Kyle said, "and you are married." The clerk asked, looking between them. Kyle and Paloma exchanged glances. They'd discussed this the night before, knowing the question would come. "Not yet," Kyle said, "but we will be as soon as we can find someone to perform the ceremony." The clerk looked uncomfortable. "I should tell you that some folks around here might not take kindly to that kind of union. The law might allow it, but people are not always guided by law." "We know," Paloma said quietly, "but we are willing to face that." "Well then," the clerk said, pulling out forms. "Let's get this paperwork started. The filing fee is $14. They paid the fee from their combined money, and the clerk walked them through the process. The claim would be filed in Kyle's name, since a married woman's property belonged to her husband anyway, but they would both be listed as occupants. It took an hour to complete all the forms, and by the time they walked out of the office, they were officially homesteaders. "We need supplies," Paloma said, looking at the general store across the street. "Tools, seeds for spring, food to last the winter." "And we need to get married," Kyle added. The clerk was right. It will be easier if we are legally wed. They found a minister at the small church on the edge of town, a young man who'd only been in Jefferson for 6 months. His name was Reverend Martin, and he listened to their story, or the abbreviated version of it, without judgment. When Kyle asked if he would marry them, the Reverend agreed immediately. "When would you like the ceremony?" he asked. "Now," Paloma said. "Today, if possible." Reverend Martin blinked. "That is rather sudden. Are you certain? Marriage is a serious commitment." "We are certain," Kyle said, taking Paloma's hand. So they were married in the small church with Reverend Martin and his wife as witnesses. Paloma wore her traveling dress with the Apache beadwork, and Kyle wore his cleanest shirt and his only pair of pants without holes. They exchanged simple vows, promising to love and honor each other for as long as they both lived. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Kyle kissed his bride and felt like the luckiest man alive. Mrs. Martin insisted they come to dinner at the parsonage, and they spent the evening with the young couple, who were kind and curious and didn't seem to care at all that Paloma was Apache. Reverend Martin had come from Boston, he explained, where he'd been involved in abolition work before the war. His wife was from Philadelphia, and they'd both come west because they believed in equality and justice, however rare those things might be. "You will face challenges," Reverend Martin said over coffee after dinner. "I would be lying if I said otherwise. But I believe that love can overcome most obstacles with faith and determination." "We have determination," Kyle said, "and we are learning faith." They spent their wedding night in the boarding house in Jefferson, in a small room with a real bed and clean sheets. Kyle had never been with a woman before, though he didn't tell Paloma that. She was patient and gentle, guiding him, and what they shared that night was tender and passionate and utterly perfect. Afterward, they lay together in the darkness, and Kyle felt a happiness so complete it was almost frightening. "I love you," he whispered into her hair. "I love you too," Paloma replied, her voice soft and certain. "However long we have, whatever comes, I love you." They spent the next day buying supplies in Jefferson. Tools for building, seeds for planting, food staples that would keep through the winter, blankets and dishes, and all the small necessities of setting up a household. Kyle bought a rifle and ammunition, not for hunting people but for protection against wolves and bears. Paloma bought fabric and thread, saying she could sew clothes and quilts during the long winter months. They also bought a horse, a sturdy mare with gentle eyes that Paloma fell in love with immediately. The horse was expensive, taking a large chunk of their remaining money, but worth it to see the joy on Paloma's face as she led the mare around the corral. "What will you name her?" Kyle asked. "Morning," Paloma said without hesitation, because morning came after all. With their supplies loaded on a wagon Kyle purchased with the last of his savings, they left Jefferson on their third day there. The wagon was pulled by Kyle's gelding with Morning tied behind, and they headed south toward their valley and whatever future awaited them there. The journey took 2 full days, as Paloma had predicted. They camped the first night beside the road, sleeping under the wagon for shelter, wrapped in blankets and each other's warmth. The second day brought them to the valley, and it was everything Paloma had described and more. The stream was frozen now, but Kyle could see where it ran, cutting through the middle of the valley. There were trees for lumber and shelter from wind, open spaces for crops and a garden, and mountains rising in the distance, purple and majestic against the winter sky. "This is it," Paloma said, looking around with wonder. "This is the place." They spent the remaining weeks of winter building. Kyle had some experience with construction from his ranch work, and Paloma proved surprisingly skilled with an axe and saw. They worked together, cutting logs and shaping them, building a small cabin one log at a time. It was hard work, exhausting work, but also satisfying in a way that Kyle had never experienced. They were building something that was theirs, a home rather than just a shelter. The cabin took shape slowly. 4 walls, a roof, a real door that hung straight and closed properly. 1 room for now, but they could add more later if needed. Kyle cut openings for windows, and they covered them with oiled paper until they could afford real glass. Paloma chinked the gaps between logs with mud and grass, making the walls solid against the wind. They moved in before the cabin was completely finished, eager to be out of the tent they'd been living in. That first night in their home, sitting before their own fireplace eating beans and cornbread off their own plates, felt like luxury beyond measure. Kyle looked across at his wife and felt his heart swell with love and pride. Paloma coughed occasionally, but no more than she had in the line shack. There was still no blood, still no sign of the terrible decline the doctor had predicted. Kyle let himself hope cautiously that maybe the diagnosis had been wrong. Consumption was tricky, he knew. Sometimes people thought they had it when they had something else, something less deadly. Spring came late to the valley but glorious when it arrived. The stream thawed, running clear and cold from the mountains. Green pushed up through the brown grass, and flowers appeared seemingly overnight. Kyle and Paloma planted their garden, working the soil together until their hands were blistered and their backs ached. But the sight of those first green shoots emerging from the earth made every moment of pain worthwhile. They planted corn and beans and squash, the three sisters that Paloma said her people had grown for generations. They planted potatoes and carrots and onions. Paloma planted herbs she knew from her Apache grandmother and others she'd learned at the mission. The garden became her domain, and Kyle loved watching her work there, her hands in the soil, coaxing life from the earth. He built a small barn for the horses and a chicken coop for the chickens they bought from a passing trader. Paloma sewed curtains for their windows when they finally got real glass, which Kyle bought after selling pelts he'd trapped that winter. The cabin became a home, filled with small touches that were uniquely theirs. In the evenings, they would sit together and talk, or Paloma would sew while Kyle mended tools or cleaned his rifle. Sometimes, Paloma would sing songs in Apache, haunting melodies that spoke of her people's history and pain and endurance. Kyle didn't understand all the words, but he felt the emotion behind them, and he would hold her afterward when the songs made her cry for what had been lost. Summer was glorious and hard. The garden flourished, demanding constant attention. Kyle built fences and cleared more land, dreaming of maybe running a few cattle someday. Nothing like the big ranches, but enough for their needs. Paloma worked in the garden and sewed for extra money, riding morning into Jefferson once a month to deliver dresses and shirts she'd made, bringing back supplies and news from town. The people of Jefferson grew accustomed to seeing her, this Apache woman who spoke better English than half of them and could sew a straight seam that would last for years. Some were kind, some were cold, but most were simply practical. Good work was good work, regardless of who did it, and Paloma's work was exceptional. On one of these trips, Paloma visited the doctor in Jefferson, a different doctor than the one who diagnosed her. Kyle went with her, anxious and hopeful in equal measure. The doctor examined her thoroughly, listening to her breathing, asking questions about her symptoms. "You say another doctor told you that you had consumption?" the doctor asked, washing his hands after the examination. "Yes," Paloma confirmed, "in Fort Shaw about 8 months ago." "And he said you had 6 months to live?" "Yes." The doctor shook his head. "Well, unless consumption has changed its nature entirely, I would say that doctor was wrong. Your lungs sound clear. You have no fever, no excessive coughing, no blood. Whatever you had 8 months ago, it was not consumption, or if it was the mildest case I've ever heard of, and you have recovered." Kyle felt like the ground had shifted under his feet. "She's not dying. We are all dying, young man, from the moment we are born. But this young woman is not dying any faster than the rest of us, as far as I can determine." The doctor turned to Paloma. "You should still be careful. Get plenty of rest, eat well, don't overwork yourself. But you are healthy as far as I can tell." Outside the doctor's office, Paloma stood very still, staring at nothing. Kyle touched her arm gently. "Did you hear what he said? You're not dying." "I heard," Paloma whispered. "I heard, but I cannot believe it. For 8 months I have lived as a dying woman. I made plans around my death. I accepted that I would never see my sister's children grow up, never have children of my own, never grow old. And now I am told it was all wrong. It was all wrong, Kyle said, pulling her into his arms. You get to live, Paloma. We get to live together, not just for months but for years, decades maybe. We get to grow old together. She clung to him and wept, great shaking sobs that drew stares from people passing on the street. Kyle didn't care. He held his wife and let her cry out 8 months of fear and grief and acceptance of death that turned out to be unnecessary. When she finally calmed, he wiped her tears with his thumbs and kissed her forehead. "Let's go home," he said. "Yes," Paloma agreed. "Let's go home." The ride back to the valley was quiet, both of them lost in thought. That night, lying in their bed, Paloma spoke into the darkness. "I want a child," she said. "I never let myself want it before because I thought I would die and leave the child motherless. But now, if I am not dying, I want a family with you." Kyle pulled her closer. "I want that too," he said. "A whole house full of children if we're blessed with them." "One at a time," Paloma said, and he could hear the smile in her voice. Fall came and went, the garden producing bountifully. They canned and preserved everything they could, filling their small root cellar with jars and barrels, preparing for the winter ahead. Paloma's belly began to swell with new life, and Kyle watched in awe as his wife carried their child. She glowed with health and happiness, all traces of the fragile dying woman gone. They spent that winter in their cabin, cozy and warm, planning for the spring and the baby that would come with it. Kyle added a second room to the cabin, a bedroom separate from the main living space, so the baby would have somewhere to sleep. Paloma sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her hands gentle on the soft fabric. Their son was born on a cold March morning, with the help of a midwife from Jefferson, who Paloma had befriended. The birth was long and difficult, and Kyle paced outside the bedroom for hours, listening to Paloma's labored breathing and occasional cries. When the midwife finally opened the door and handed him a squalling, red-faced baby, Kyle thought his heart might explode from joy. "A boy," the midwife announced, "strong and healthy." Kyle was allowed in to see Paloma, who lay exhausted but smiling in their bed, her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat. "We have a son," she said wonderingly. "We have a son," Kyle agreed, carefully handing the baby to her. "What should we name him?" They discussed names throughout the winter but never quite settled on one. Now, looking at their son, Paloma said, "I want to name him after my father, but using an American name. My father was called Tall Pine in Apache. What if we called our son Pine Tree?" Just one word like a last name, but as his first name, Pine Tree Patterson. "Pine Tree Patterson," Kyle repeated, testing it. "I like it. It's strong." So their son became Pine Tree, and he brought joy into their lives that Kyle had never imagined possible. Watching Paloma nurse their son, singing to him in Apache and English and Spanish, Kyle felt blessed beyond measure. He'd gone from a lone cowboy with no prospects to a husband and father with a home and land and a family who loved him. The years passed, marked by seasons and growth. Pine Tree learned to walk and talk, a bright child who inherited his mother's intelligence and his father's stubbornness. 2 years after Pine Tree came a daughter they named Primrose, called Rosie from birth because she was pink and perfect as a flower. 3 years after Rosie came another son, this one named Kestrel after the bird Kyle loved to watch hunting over their fields. The cabin grew with their family, additional rooms added as needed. The garden expanded, and Kyle did eventually get his cattle, just a small herd but enough to provide meat and milk and a little extra income from selling calves. They were not rich, but they were comfortable, and more importantly, they were happy. Paloma never fully escaped prejudice. There were people in Jefferson who would never accept her, who muttered about breeds and savages when they thought she couldn't hear. But there were also people who defended her, who pointed out that she was a better Christian than most church-going folk, that she worked harder than any two people they knew, that her children were polite and smart and a credit to their raising. Reverend Martin and his wife became close friends, visiting several times a year and always welcome at the Patterson house. The Reverend baptized all 3 children and never once suggested that Paloma should give up her Apache heritage, only that she add Christianity to it rather than replace one with the other. Kyle watched his children grow with pride and wonder. Pine Tree showed an aptitude for ranching, already helping with the cattle by age 7. Rosie loved the garden as much as her mother, spending hours among the plants, learning the names of herbs and how to use them. Kestrel was still small, but he showed signs of his father's way with horses, fearless around animals twice his size. On their 10th anniversary, Kyle and Paloma sat on the porch of their house, watching the sun set over their valley. The children were in bed, the cattle were settled, and the world was peaceful. Kyle held Paloma's hand, marveling as he always did that this woman had chosen to share her life with him. "You remember that morning in the line shack?" Paloma asked. "When you insisted I was not going to die?" "I remember," Kyle said. "You told me I was stubborn and foolish." "You were," Paloma agreed. "But you were also right. I did not die. Morning came and I was still here, and every morning since then I have been grateful for your stubbornness." "I am grateful for your willingness to be foolish with me," Kyle replied. They sat in comfortable silence, hands linked, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Kyle thought about that blizzard 10 years ago, about finding a woman in the snow who'd expected to die. He thought about how one choice, one moment of deciding to help rather than ride on, had led to all of this: a home, a family, a life full of love and purpose. "Do you ever regret it?" Paloma asked softly. "The prejudice, the difficulties, all the challenges that come from being married to an Apache woman." "Never," Kyle said firmly. "Not once, not for a single moment. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Paloma. You and our children, this life we have built together. I would face 1,000 difficulties, 1,000 prejudices, and never regret my choice." "You know I love you," Paloma said, turning to look at him in the fading light. "I know," Kyle replied. "And you know I love you, always?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Always," Kyle confirmed. The years continued to pass, bringing changes and challenges, but also joy and growth. Pine Tree grew tall and strong, eventually taking over much of the ranch work from his father. He fell in love with a girl from Jefferson, a farmer's daughter named Emily, and they married when he turned 20. They built a small house on the far end of the Patterson land, close enough for family but far enough for privacy. Rosie became an expert in herbs and healing, learning everything her mother knew and then teaching herself more from books Kyle bought for her whenever he could afford them. She never married, saying she was wedded to her plants and her healing work. The people of Jefferson came to rely on her, seeking her help for ailments great and small. Kestrel followed his father's footsteps, becoming a horse trainer whose reputation spread throughout Montana. People came from hundreds of miles away to have Kyle Patterson train their horses, and he commanded good prices for his skills. He married late, at 30, to a widow with 2 children of her own, and they blended their families together with love and patience. Kyle and Paloma grew old together, their hair turning gray, their hands becoming gnarled with arthritis, but their love never diminishing. They celebrated their 40th anniversary surrounded by children and grandchildren. More than 20 people gathered in and around the house that had started as a simple one-room cabin. Reverend Martin came to help them celebrate, ancient now himself, his wife having passed 2 years before. He said a blessing over the family, thanking God for bringing Kyle and Paloma together, for the life they'd built, and the legacy they were leaving in their children and grandchildren. "You two have been an inspiration," the Reverend said. "Proof that love can overcome any obstacle, that family is not defined by blood or race but by commitment and care." "We were just stubborn," Kyle said, winking at Paloma. "And foolish," Paloma added, smiling. "Perhaps," Reverend Martin agreed. "But stubbornness and foolishness, in service of love, can change the world." Kyle and Paloma lived into their 70s, a remarkable age for the time and place. They saw Montana become a state in 1889, saw the frontier close and the Wild West become something people talked about as history rather than present. They saw cars begin to replace horses, saw electricity come to Jefferson, though it would be years before it reached their valley. Kyle died first, in his sleep on a warm summer night, his hand holding Paloma's as it had for more than 40 years. He simply didn't wake up one morning, gone peacefully between one breath and the next. Paloma grieved deeply, but not desperately. She'd had 43 years with the man she loved, far more than she'd ever expected that morning in the lined shack, when she'd told him she'd be gone by morning. She lived another 2 years after Kyle's death, spending her time with her children and grandchildren, passing on stories of her Apache heritage and of the man who'd saved her from a blizzard and given her a life beyond her wildest dreams. She died on a cold winter morning, the kind of morning that reminded everyone of that blizzard so long ago, and her children said she went with a smile on her face, as if seeing something wonderful just beyond their sight. They buried her next to Kyle in the small cemetery they'd established on a hill overlooking their valley. Pine Tree and Kestrel dug the grave, and Rosie prepared her mother's body, dressing her in a dress that combined Apache and white styles, honoring both parts of her heritage. The whole family gathered for the service, along with most of the town of Jefferson, paying respects to a woman who'd overcome every obstacle life had thrown at her. The Patterson Ranch continued, passed down through generations, and the story of Kyle and Paloma became family legend, told to each new generation. The story of a cowboy who found an Apache woman in a blizzard, who refused to let her die even when she said she'd be gone by morning. The story of morning that never came, or rather, of morning that came and kept coming, day after day, year after year, bringing light and life and love. In Jefferson, Montana, they still tell the story, though details have blurred with time and retelling. They talk about the mixed-race family who proved that love knew no boundaries, that stubbornness and foolishness in pursuit of love could build something lasting and beautiful. They point to the Patterson Ranch, still operating more than 100 years later, still owned by descendants of that original union. And sometimes, on cold winter mornings when the snow falls heavy and the wind howls, people swear they can see 2 figures riding through the valley, a man and a woman on horseback, heading toward home. Some say it's just wishful thinking, seeing patterns in snow and shadows. But others, the ones who believe in love that transcends death, know better. They know that some loves are strong enough to echo through time, strong enough that morning never really comes because the love never ends, just transforms into something eternal. The Patterson house still stands, renovated and expanded over the years, but with the original cabin at its heart. Those logs that Kyle and Paloma cut and shaped together more than a century ago. The garden Paloma planted still blooms each spring, tended by her descendants, herbs and flowers growing in the same soil she worked. The cemetery on the hill holds generations now, but the oldest graves belong to Kyle and Paloma Patterson, their headstones simple but inscribed with words that tell their story. He found her in a blizzard. She thought she'd be gone by morning. Morning never came. Love never ended.